All right, we're back for another episode of the SCMP Live Chat and Q&A. And this week we got a special one. The reason why is usually I have like other people in the media or people that are, I guess, photographers or something to do with media on here. But this time around, man, we're gonna have some people that are really deep inside, some insiders of the game, MMA managers slash agents slash I don't know. What would you call, like, would you call yourself a manager or
I
would
guess
you call
manager.
yourself you
Also, you could say a fixer when
yeah, exactly, right? A fixer, right? A
yeah,
fixer is like a great term
yeah.
because some managers, I think a lot of people get confused with like what exactly managers do for
Mhm.
fighters. And I know because I talk to managers that every manager has a different role because some fighters have more than one manager or more than one agent. And could you explain, because you run your whole company yourself, right? So you're the
Right.
top guy. So
Yeah.
kind of
The only guy.
explain like the different roles of like what managers do for fighters.
Yeah, it actually it depends on each fighter. My role varies fighter by fighter, and it all depends on how I fit in with their team to support them, their coaches, and so forth. But generally speaking, uh, most importantly, obviously, I try to find them fights, get them sponsors, but then between the lines and between the fights, I'm checking up on them, see how they're doing with their training, just checking in on how everything's going in life, and also touching base with their coaches to make sure that they're doing all right, their training's okay, and it's a communication game. Fighter may sometimes say one thing, and then need to just verify that with the coach, make sure that everything is good to go. Because most fighters are just, I'm ready to go, and just I usually like to touch base with the coach too, just to make sure everyone's on the same page.
For sure, man. And you make a great point right there, is that the coaches are also involved because they have to, they have to be in the mix, right? You cannot just go straight to the fighter because
Of course,
the fighters, they need someone else, a second person there to kind of an outside look, right, into
of
like their
course,
training and their health and everything. Because fighters, like you said, they just want to fight. They just want to get in the cage, and that's their purpose in life. But sometimes it's not the right time, right, for a lot of the fighters, and
right, and
you
yes,
have to talk with the coach, right? So,
right.
have you run into like that? Sometimes that's kind of a problem, like you're talking to the fighter and the fighter says one thing and then you're talking to the coach and the coach says another.
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, it's more. It's I wouldn't say it's a problem. It's just a matter of keeping communication open with everyone, just to make sure again that everyone is on the same page. So a fighter may genuinely think he's good to go, he's ready to go, but from the coach's perspective, maybe he needs a little more time, or he's hurt, he's got to take some time to rest, take it easy a little bit. So it's always almost a game in terms of just extracting what the truth and reality of the actual situation is, between talking with the coach, talking with the fighters, and whoever else may be important to the process. And as far as a manager goes, I like to say, because I'm joining their team. They're not joining me, so to speak. So I'm here to be a known quantity. I'm not here to be a variable. I'm here to be someone that they can rely on, someone that's here to support them. So that neither the coach nor the fighters is wondering, oh, what the heck is my manager doing? Or just being blindsided by, oh, hey, I got you a fight next week against XYZ guy. I accepted the bout. Boom. That's not how I personally do things. I think most good managers wouldn't operate that way. They would have an open dialogue with all involved in the fighters' camp.
Definitely. Well, everybody that's jumping in the chat right now, just put your questions there and then we'll get to those questions. Anything to do with like how the businesses run, how managers do their job, anything, anything. It could be about Conor McGregor, whatever. Ask us whatever you want. we'll get to those questions eventually. You know, I got a list of things that I want to talk about with these guys. Kevin is actually joining us now. Kevin, do you think you could put your phone sideways? Because then you'll go into the like a large screen.
Like that.
Does that work?
No, actually, it doesn't.
You got to put the screen rotate on it,
This
probably.
is the farthest I can go with.
Oh, is it? Is that? Okay. All right.
See. Does this work? No, I go backwards.
Okay, no problem, no problem, no problem. All right, it's all good. It's all good. All right, so let's get into a couple. Well, let's start with
John. I can't hear you.
You can't hear me. Can you hear me now? Is he frozen?
I mean, you're good on my end.
Yeah. Well, he just disappeared into the abyss. But oh, so we got. Let's just while Kevin's figuring out some stuff. Mike, there's someone Tubu 1220. Tubu sounds like, of course, that's if you're Korean, you know what Tubu is. So it must be a Korean fella, or
I think I know who that is.
Oh, you know who that is?
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. No, I'll give it to him free of charge, but it'll be $20 for shipping and handling for him.
Okay. So I guess you got to go into the DMs and check it out. So let's get into this question from WMMA Scene. How did you gents get started in fighter management? So I guess you could go into that and tell us like a recap of how everything got started.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, I was involved in, just from a legal perspective, in law school, just getting involved with the legal and regulatory aspects of MMA, just going around to conferences, meeting people from commissions and promotions, and just building a network and building a knowledge base. And then eventually, as I developed in my career outside of MMA and just built my own skills, while I was training at Hyon Ko Academy, one of my good friends, Marcus Surin, who's been on your show, you spoke with him, and I told him, like, hey, if you ever need help with anything, just let me know. And it came like a little while after he had gotten a contact for Bellator, and he had asked me to help him out. And the rest is history, I guess. It started with him, and then slowly, as I just continued to do work for him, other people at the academy, they saw what I was doing. They ostensibly liked what I was doing. They referred me to Talita, Tiago, and other fighters, and it's just slowly grown from there. In fact, just this past week, I spoke with Black Rob, one of the coaches at Hyon Ko Academy, about a couple of the fighters that he works with, and just basically through word of mouth, that's just how it continues to grow and grow. And so for anyone that's looking to get into it, ideally, if you have a legal background, that certainly helps, not necessarily required. But I think the biggest thing for me that was helpful is being someone that trains in a related martial art, in my case, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's almost like a direct feeder in terms of being directly involved with people that train in the sport, that are involved with the sport, and so forth.
Yeah, and one thing you guys have in common, of course, you guys are both, MMA agents / managers, but you guys both train. Kevin has, he's still a young guy. How old are you, Mike?
I just turned 23.
38.
Okay, so yeah, so big, like he just turned 23, right? So he's a young guy starting off young. He's trained a lot, with a lot of top fighters, amateur fights too, right? So how did you get started, Kevin? Like, tell us a recap story of your journey, because it's just starting.
I guess my first professional fight, it started in a jiu-jitsu gym So I've been away from Korea for like 12 years, and the first time I came back, I enrolled into a jiu-jitsu gym that was nearby. I was training there for a couple of months, and this girl came up, and she kind of like asked me, like, have you fought before? I was like, yeah, and she just straightforward asked me, like, can you train me so I can fight amateur MMA? I was like, yeah, cool. And 3 months later, she made her amateur debut. 2 months later, She won her fight against the kickboxing champion. And then I got a call from the promoter, which was from TFC, Top Fighting Championship, asking if she could make her pro debut in 4 weeks. And yeah, that's where I started from. I moved my
So
team
basically,
to
that
Team
was your
Man.
first.
Yeah, this was my first fight that I ever booked a professional fight. This was 2017, I believe, or 2016. Yeah.
Okay.
Then I
I didn't
switched
even know
gym.
that.
Yeah, I started working with TFC actually here in Korea. She fought Chejae. So, anyways, moving on. She retired. She was like 31 years old when she started. She was very, very late in the sport. She retired, and I kind of decided like I want to move to an MMA gym. And Stun Gun Donghyun Kim's gym just happens to be 8 minutes away from my house. So I moved there, and I met a fighter. He was a 145er. At that time, he was ranked I think number 6 in Korea. He was the AFC champion. And while seeing him, I'm just basically just training with him in jiu-jitsu, and I was seeing how much of a trouble he was having with relationships when it comes to the promotion, and trouble having communication in English with other promotions. So I kind of like reached out, and I was like, hey, if you want, I can help you out with translations here and stuff. And from there, we moved on. After he defended his belt for the third time in AFC, knocking out another world champion, I called him and I said, if you could come to Thailand, maybe I could hook you up with Ruby Sports. And yeah, that's how it all started.
All right. Well, there you go. There's the start, the beginning of everybody. Now with Kevin, you're recently in Las Vegas, right? So this is something that I wanted to get into, and I could get Mike's thoughts on it. That was your first time, right, going over to the States?
Yeah, it was
Recently?
my first time to the States.
And we've talked about this off the air, but I wanted to ask you, you know what I mean, from your perspective of you dealing with like the culture of America for the first time. Talk about that. Like, just talk about openly, you know what I mean? Like what you experienced, and especially with all the stuff with like the attacks on Asians and stuff like that. Because we talked about it. Just talk openly, because I want to get your experience, and then talk to Mike about how, because he's on the East Coast, right? It's like two different coasts.
Yeah.
He was in Las Vegas. He's on the East Coast. He grew up in the States. You went to the States for the first time. Just tell me your experience for the last couple of months in Las Vegas.
Well, first of all, when I landed in Seattle, we were harassed by the borders customs. That's actually the best memory I had from the States. People were not really familiar with Asians coming into town for fighting. Even if they were very familiar with the UFC, and even if they do watch the UFC, they were really not familiar with Asians actually coming in with the proper visa documents and the right of invitation from the UFC that there were actual Asian fighters. Also here in Vegas, I kind of realized how much of a difference level we have compared to Korea to Vegas. Meeting high level fighters, working with them, working with new coach, seeing all kinds of fighters from Bellator, PFL, UFC, kind of gave me a different perspective of how they function compared to Korea or to the US. Wait, is this your question or was it something else?
No, just keep going, man. Just keep going.
Yeah, and regarding the taxes, yeah, a lot of fighters in Korea that are currently in the UFC gets taxed a lot, and that's where they kind of lose half of their money, if that makes sense. Because first of all, the Korean coaches or the Korean managers outside the United States that's working for them are charging them the same amount of taxes that the Americans are charging, which they're usually not getting returned, or they don't really know how to fix taxes. While when I was in America, you could see a lot of fighters actually spending more money just so that they could get around the taxes legally. So these kind of things were, I guess, the biggest difference we had compared to Korea, where the training obviously is very different. The training partners you get is very different, and the mindset is very different. And also the way they run around their financial status was also very different. So that's something that I could have learned, and my client Hyon should learn. She's still not used to it. And yeah, the training was good, everything was good, but obviously the racism was definitely something that was there, and that really surprised me because the American friends that I had outside of the States were not the Americans that I've encountered while I was in the States. So
What do you mean by
yeah.
that? Like, of course, you were in
So
Phuket for like a couple of years, so you ran into people from all over the world, especially people from America, and
oh yeah,
those
yeah, yeah.
people
And it's
are different from the ones that you encountered in Las Vegas.
yeah, I mean George Hickman, I mean the Hickman brothers are Americans and they're actually from a countryside of the States. So you would expect them to be harsh to Asians, but what I got from them was just like cool, you know, they love the Asian vibes, they know what the differences of other Asians are, what the Asian fighter, especially a Korean fighter, can bring to the table. But when I was in America, it's like I don't know what should I say. They were kind of looking down on us inside the gym, outside the gym, kind of like thinking we're weak, if that makes sense. And my godfather is American, so it was kind of different vibe I got from them. It's, different of colors or races or whatever you call it. And I should say like Americans would define people from colors, not race, if that makes sense. So
Oh,
the moment, like I said, from the moment I landed in Seattle, I could already tell these people were not happy that we came here, if that makes sense. We went to Vegas, and I kind of realized there's only like 3 or 4 Asian fighters in town. So if you add me and G on there, it's like 4 or 6. And you could already tell they do their own thing aside from communication wise, training wise, or socializing stuff. So yeah, I should say that was the biggest surprising factor in my opinion.
yeah. Well, I grew up in the States, so I know exactly what you mean. I lived it, right? So, Mike, when like yourself, man, like I know this is it all bleeds into MMA eventually, right? So for yourself, like on the East Coast, like has anything changed for you, you know what I mean, with like being an Asian American and dealing with that stuff outside of, the job, and has it bleed into anything that you've been doing in your work life?
No, not at least certainly not in a bad way. And I guess in that regard, I've been very fortunate. I mean, even growing up, I never really encountered anything too traumatic or too negative an experience that had any kind of lasting impact on me necessarily. And even with being in the MMA industry, which yes, there's not as much Asian representation, both certainly behind the scenes in terms of like the business side of it, but I never made like a big deal out of it. I never considered myself, oh, I am an Asian American manager. I am just a manager that happens to be Korean, happens to be Asian American, and I just approached the fight game and the fight business how ostensibly anyone else would. And certainly there actually were, for example, Rich Chow. He was, one of the big names in MMA for quite a while now, but going back to his days in like LEXC, Strike Force, I was able to forge a very good relationship with him during his time at Bellator. He was someone I always looked up to during those earlier years when he was with those other promotions. And, here I am now talking to him, putting fights together with him. And even outside of MMA, there's a football agent, Eugene Lee, who has a book out and it was featured on ESPN before. Like, just reach out to him and just to network with him. So where there are Asian American people in the MMA business or the sports business, if there's an organic opportunity to talk to them, reach out to them, sure, I'll go for it. But I don't necessarily try to kind of highlight that fact necessarily, like for better or for worse. If anything, I'm more so trying to understand other cultures and other people that I am encountering. For example, I've been like with Talita, for example, she's Brazilian, and I've taken Portuguese lessons just so I could be able to speak with her in Portuguese and just with the guys at Henzo's, and because I think it's a good way of being able to communicate with them in their native tongue. And at the very least, even though my Portuguese certainly isn't good, but it's at least it's sincere, and I think they at least appreciate that, and it allows me to connect with fighters or other people within that sphere, like for example, the instructors at the academy at a higher level.
Well, yeah, it's, I understand that, like, you try to like not highlight that, right? But it's something that I try not to highlight either too much. You know what I mean? Like, of course, when you meet somebody, you see who they are, right? They're Asian or whatever. They're black or they're Mexican or Brazilian or whatever they are. You know what I mean? You try not to put that in the forefront. You try to kind of just move on with what they do, right? And the one thing that the one thing that I notice is, like, I'm not Chinese, okay, but I do work for the South China Morning Post, and whenever I do interviews for the South China Morning Post, if you go into the comments and sometimes on social media, number one, they think I'm Chinese, so they attack the Chinese aspect of it, and they, the coronavirus and all of that stuff. Number two is, yeah, they're just like, why is UFC fighters, or why are fighters doing interviews with the Chinese news outlet? Like the Chinese or blah blah blah. And I'm just like, man, it's there. You can't hide from it. You know what I mean? Like, I try not to like push it too much, but I think it's something that we should talk about, because nobody talks about it in MMA. You know what I mean? There's like like African Americans talking about their side of the story, but really you don't see it from like Asians at all. Like, they just kind of keep quiet, to be honest with you. You know what I mean? Like, I wish that somebody, bigger than who I am, I mean, I'm nobody, right? But at least I got a little bit of a voice. So I would like to kind of get out there and open up the dialogue a little bit more. And I hope people start understanding that more if they do watch this, and they understand that, not everybody's Chinese. And I think that's still a problem in America, right? That everybody thinks that an Asian person is Chinese.
Oh, yeah. I mean, not just America. You just can go worldwide with this, and even at the professional sports level. I mean, I think just recently, old tweet resurfaced by that soccer player Megan Rapinoe, like making some kind of anti-Asian type of comment. I think I remember a couple of, I forget which Olympics. It was like I want to say like the Spanish volleyball team or like basketball team, like they do like all slanty eye things and things like that. There's always, perhaps even more so than other cultures or races, seems to be almost an inherent level of like subtle racism against us, I suppose. But again, for me personally, like, like going back to your comment on like the comment section, like I never read the comment section on anything, on any website or Reddit or Twitter. Like that's where all the keyboard warriors live. Says they say everything, whether it's about Asians, women, other races, anything. I mean, it's who knows what you're gonna find. And yeah, I think at some point it should be more of a mainstream dialogue, and I think from what I can tell, it's at least being discussed more nowadays. It can always be better. It can always be more. Again, it's more of a pursuit. You'll never get there to a point where everyone's perfectly satisfied with what's going on. But I think personally, I've seen progress. But for me personally, I just press forward with what I'm doing and let my actions speak for themselves. And if and when I do get into a position where I could have some kind of impact on that, then maybe perhaps I would expound on that topic more.
Oh, of course, man. Of course. Like
okay, so
that's like, yeah.
I'll just tell you a frank story. I don't know if I'll get in trouble by this, but I was talking to Kevin Jong, who was cornering Sting at the fight week, and I was discussing some things with him. And I don't know if he's British. I don't know if he was American. He just walks over to us and starts staring at us. So I was like, oh, cool, another guy just staring at me. And I kind of noticed that his tattoo was very weird, like in a way, like, oh, that shit actually looks familiar. So I kind of looked into it, and little or not, it was a rising flag from Japan, and he had a Japanese whore, I should say, and a Buddhist mark behind his shoulder blades with a rising flag, which just represents, I guess the lady actually represents Korean ladies that were brought as slaves, and obviously the Buddhist mark and the rising flag representing the Japanese, how should I say this? Yeah, the Japanese culture from 1920s. So I called him out into it and I said, hey, bro, you have a cool tattoo. And he did not reply back to me. And I asked him again, bro, where do you get that tattoo from? And the first question he asked me was, where are you from? And I said, I was from Korea. And as soon as I said that, he walked away from me. He ran, like he literally walked away and running away. So like cases like this, and this was in Vegas. So when I had to interfere or run into situations like this, it just pops into my mind like, man, what the fuck are you guys thinking when you guys are making those tattoos, especially when you're white and you clearly seem like you know what that tattoo represents. And like Mike said, you don't really want to, how should I say it, like show it or try to say, oh, this happened to me, that happened to me. But the thing is, if this thing constantly happens to you on a daily basis, and even if you try to ignore it and it's still there, then I feel like somebody, even if you're a nobody or a somebody, needs to speak for it. And that's one thing I've been doing in Vegas. If I feel like this person is anti-Asian or racist towards any race, then I would like to have a conversation with that person just to clarify to them that not all Asians will stay quiet. And you know me, John, like I'm very harsh with my words sometimes, and I can't really stay quiet from time to time. And whenever I interact with people like this, it just doesn't piss me off. But I kind of feel like even I have to speak for myself and in behalf of all the other Asian fighters that I know eventually they'll run into, because at the end of the day, we're all in the same business, right? And it's not just fighters, man. It's just like I go to a supermarket with Gion. She's very innocent, you know. She doesn't know a word of English. She's just running around the supermarket looking for some fruits, and then you run into some racist scumbags that just give you a stink eye, and that just literally tells you to stay 6 feet apart. When Vegas literally just got rid of all the restrictions, so stuff like this, you know, that really just kind of bothers me, I should say, and I feel like people just kind of need to step up on those moments. I'm not saying like you need to go on a rally and then run over all the street and say, oh, all you Americans or all you blah, 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 or anti-Asians. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is anytime someone interferes with racism, I feel like they need to stand up for themselves. I don't care if you're Asian, if you're African American, if you're Mexican, if you're Brazilian. I don't care. But if shit like this happens, then yeah, at that moment, you need to stand up for yourself. It's like, don't stay quiet, because the more you stay quiet, I know they're gonna do this even more harder. And there's no guarantee that this is the only time you'll interfere with that person. So you might as well just make it clear with them from the start, right? And this has already happened to us in Vegas. I think it was our third day. Someone was asking Gion why she doesn't speak English for like a couple of times, and it kind of got into my head. And I talked to her and I said, why are you so ignorant? Like, she comes from a different background. You come from a different background. It's just that you happen to be born in America, speaking your own native language. Doesn't mean she needs to speak this. So stuff like this, I feel like you just have to get it out the way, especially if it's a person that you will interfere from day to day, you know, just to show them and just to teach them that not all Asians are the same. Yes, I've been called Chinese more than 100 times, I believe, in Vegas. I've been trying to correct them. Or even just to look down on you and say, hey, man, you can be racist to Asians, and they'll just stay quiet. No, you shouldn't. I don't think that you should ever give them a surface of image that all Asians will just stay quiet. Sometimes you got to fight back, man. I'm not saying that you need to punch them or yell at them. Just educate them, because sometimes people not might be as educated as you think they are. So these little things I feel like need some change, especially now that a lot of Asian fighters are gonna be going to the States or to Thailand or anywhere around the world. So hopefully anyone watching this will kind of realize they need to stand for themselves.
Yeah, the reason why I brought it up is because, you know, in the fight game, you know, inside the gym, I don't think it's that big of a problem. There is some issues, right? But it's not as big of a problem, right? Around the world. I'm just talking about around the world, not even just America, just
Yeah,
around
yeah,
the world. Inside the gym, it's not
yeah,
really that big of a problem. But when you step out of it, you know, and I know Jian, right? Jian Kim, she's UFC flyweight. Like I know her personally. I've met her, been around her. She's a very like happy-go-lucky. Like she has no like hate towards anybody in her bones, right? So when I hear stuff like that happening to her, it's just like, man, she must have a bad taste in her mouth, like going over there. But you know,
no,
she's also
the
having
thing
the
is,
life time of her life too.
yeah, if this happens in the gym, or let's say her opponent does this, then it's sweet, I'll tell you that, because then she has the right to beat her ass and just put her in her place, you know what I mean? It's so simple. If you have a trouble with someone you're fighting or someone that is within the MMA and it happens to be in your division, then I would tell her to go fuck her up. As easy as that. But obviously, taking America out of it, let's say I go to Brazil, let's say I go to Abu Dhabi or China or anywhere in the world and you face racism like this, I'm not really bothered, but I'm bothered for my people, if that makes sense.
Of course, man. And you know, and
Yeah.
I hope like the Asian fighters, they could kind of, I don't know, I wish they could step up a little bit and kind of
Oh
express
yeah, they need to
themselves
step
more
up.
because they don't talk about it, right? It's just like they're too passive, and I guess that's just the culture or whatever. But I don't know, man. It bothers me sometimes when they
Well,
don't say anything.
one incident that I do remember is when Korean Zombie actually put out a open letter to
Yeah.
George St. Pierre when he had his
Yeah,
whole
yeah.
Rising something, and I thought that was the way he worded it and the way he expressed himself and explained the issue was perfectly done, and I think that's a good example of how those types of situations should be handled, and that's always stuck to me. I mean, that was years ago when that happened, but I've always remembered that, and I think that's generally the best way to go about diffusing any of those types of tensions or misunderstandings or levels of ignorance that may be coming from other people.
Yeah, and that's GSP, right? Like
Mhm.
GSP. I don't think GSP was sponsored by a company that
Mhm.
was using that symbol, right? So
Mhm.
I don't think it was a really attack on GSP so much because maybe he didn't understand what that
Yeah, it was just a
represented.
commentary on
Yeah,
this explanation
yeah,
of behind what that symbol means. And yeah, again, if you went through the comment sections of various MMA websites, people are trying to like brush it aside and stuff, of course. But that's just not the case. But as long as that kind of dialogue is being put out there and an explanation is provided, I mean, for every person that just tries to disregard that, I am sure that there are people that actually absorb that and realize, that's an interesting point. That's something to take away from that. So I think there's plenty of positives that have arisen from things like that as well.
for sure, for sure.
You know what?
And
John, speaking of Thailand, actually, I just woke up, okay? So my brain's like half functioning when we started. But going back to Thailand, like you said, I've met so many people from different regions and not just Thailand, Philippines, Abu Dhabi, Korea itself. And one thing I have to say is it's not that they're trying to be racist. Obviously, there are people that are trying to be racist towards Asian, but that's like 20% out of all the encounters I had. 80% of them are just not aware, I should say, or really educated towards Asian cultures. Like, let's say one time in Thailand, an Israeli guy asked me if I was anti-Semitic, is that what you say, or like anti-Jewish? And I kind of looked
yeah,
at him. I'm like, bro, I'm Korean, man. Like, Koreans were the Asian Jews of Asia when the Nazis were genociding the Jews. Like that's what was basically happening to Korea between Japan, right? So when I have conversations like this, it just seems like they're not familiar or uneducated towards the Asian things. So my job is not to fight them, but to just tell them a brief story or just to summarize things of the differences of what other Asians are and our history. That's just all I'm trying to say. I'm not telling you to fight them. I'm not trying to tell you to yell at them, but just simply talk to them and say, hey, man, there's a difference. And these are the differences, and these are the stories, and these are like the familiar things that we have, right? I mean, I've lived with an Israeli guy, right, in my house back in Vegas, and he didn't know that Korea and Israel was actually an allied country, and that the Jews and the Koreans actually have some things in common with. And I work for a Jew, so it's like, bro.
Yeah, but the thing
you
is,
see
like,
the
also, like, yes, know your history and all that, but then at the same time, I don't hate Japanese people. Come on, it's
No,
just
you
like
don't hate Japanese
that's
people.
yeah, it's just like it happened in the past, and I understand what happened, and you got to move on. So like, it does bleed into all of that stuff, and I wish that the fighters would talk more about it. Like, especially bigger name fighters, they don't say anything about that stuff, man. Even right
Well,
now,
they
you know what I
should,
mean?
in my
Like,
opinion.
yeah, and I you know, like, there's like famous people that come out and say things, and I'm happy they do, but I wish the fight community would come out and say stuff. But I don't know, that's just me, that's just my opinion. This is what I hope for. But yeah, and everybody experienced different things too. Like, Michael has a different experience in his life. Kevin has just experienced it for the first time. Me, I grew up in it for 20 years or so. So like, and I live in Korea now, so I don't even have to deal with it anymore. So everybody has a different view, but it stays with you. And you know, I hope it moves along, and I hope, you know, people, you know, are educated, like you said. I guess that's our job, to educate people. But let's move on to the MMA scene now. You know what I mean? Like, the Asian MMA scene. Now, the reason why I got these two on here is because Kevin, he's like here in Asia doing this thing. Of course, he was in Vegas, but he understands like a little bit deeper inside. And then we got Michael. Michael's in the States, but he kind of views the Asian MMA scene from a different eye, right? So we're gonna get to that, and like, let's start with Michael. Michael, when you view the MMA scene in Asia, right? You got like one championship, and they're pretty much the number one viewed promotion in Asia, right? And then you got a bunch of stuff going on in the regional scene. So when you look at it right now and view it, do you view one championship as the number one promotion in Asia? And what do you think of like how they're handling all of this stuff that's going on right now with the pandemic and everything?
Oh yeah, I would absolutely look at them as the number one promotion out in Asia, and beyond just being the number one promotion out in Asia, they're just simply enough one of the biggest promotions worldwide. And I think they've had a very good business plan in terms of expanding their growth. I know they just have they got that deal with TNT, which is amazing. So they've been doing a lot to expand their visibility and growth with their own roster. So it's been fun to see them from inception to get to where they are now, especially when you look at the kind of the other promotions that used to be around, like Pride, for example, that was a huge promotion that rivaled and arguably was bigger or better than the UFC at one point. And unfortunately, we all know what happened with them. So it's good to see a strong, legitimate Asian-based promotion on the rise at a global level.
Yeah, and Kevin, what about you? Where would you stack, like, let's say Ryzen is there, right? Ryzen is like the rebirth of Pride, and then you got one championship. Would you, because a lot of fighters are signing to one championship, you know that, you know, you've seen it going on, especially in Asia. Would you consider them to be the number one?
If I say one championship is not number one, will I be terrorized?
By who?
No, yeah, obviously they are number one right now. And just speaking on the Korean perspective, a lot of Koreans are getting signed. A lot of other Asian countries such as Thailand, Cambodia, or I forgot the country. Myanmar, Philippines. These countries are getting signed there and being able to fight in the lights of one championship. I guess yeah, they are number one. Yeah, they are.
Now, with them being number one, right, and them signing they sign a lot of the talent, right? They're doing a good job picking up talent before the UFC tries to come in and up on them. But at the same time, it seems like the UFC is not too interested in like the Philippines, in Japan, even in Korea. You know, what I mean, they do have a few Korean fighters, and why do you think that, Michael? Why do you think like the UFC is not as interested in like these certain? They have interest in China, right? But it's more of like a business. I think I think that's what's behind it, right? It's like more of for business. Like, okay, we could do business in this country, so we're gonna sign these types of fighters.
Mhm.
Do you think that's what's behind it?
I mean, my personal opinion is that I think a lot of it actually is more of a logistics issue than anything else, especially during pandemic times. It makes having events abroad or even within the United States that much more difficult. Like you look at Bellator, they've been having their events at Mohegan for the past year, and they're only now finally starting to go back elsewhere. They're going to LA soon, and then they'll be back in Russia. And as far as the UFC goes, I mean they have their shows all over the world, but obviously mostly in Las Vegas or in the United States. But they've had a show in Korea. They've had a show in, I believe, in Australia. They've been to Saitama in Japan before. And the thing is, everyone wants the UFC to come. And it's, in a way, like MMA shows, they're like traveling circuses. They go all over the world, putting on events where they can. And they're just, I mean, they're 52 weeks in a year, only so many events that you can have. And so it's just a matter of fitting everyone in, essentially. I mean, there's obviously plenty of interest in MMA in the Middle East. They were in Fight Island for a while. And so it's just, I think, a logistics and timing issue more than anything else. I have no doubt that they would go back to Japan. They would go back to Korea, just as they are signing fighters from those areas as well. And on the flip side of that, you look at one, they're signing American fighters, and like they have Demetrius Johnson obviously already, but like Gary Tonon's there. They just signed Gordon Ryan. So with America being the international market for them, so to speak, they're expanding in that way as well.
Are you in contact with One Championship trying to send people over there? You know what I mean? Like you said, they're trying to sign fighters from the United States. So, you have some.
Yeah, I've been in touch with them from time to time. Actually, one of my, I have a friend that actually works on the production team there. And yeah, I stay in contact with them. Not as much lately, but yeah, just with them, with all of the promotions. I mean, it's my job to do so, to keep my contacts warm, and just if I feel like I have someone that would be a good fit for them, that's when I would obviously give them a buzz and just kick the tires and see if we can make anything happen.
Kevin, now I'm going to pose the same question to you. Why do you think the UFC is not signing more Japanese fighters, more Filipino fighters? Because if you think about it, Filipino community, you live there for a long time. They're a fight country. Like Manny Pacquiao, Filipino support. You know what's tripped about Filipinos? They support Filipinos, but they also support Koreans for some reason. Like they love Koreans, right? Like
that's why.
Why? Why is it?
The Korean dramas. That's why. In fact, there's a black guy I trained with at Henzo's, that Filipino guy that, like, him and his wife love watching Korean dramas, and he's always talking to me about them. So maybe that's partly why.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, that's also
they support him. Go ahead.
That's also the thing. But if you think about it, here in Asia, just in Asia, right? They call Koreans the Asian Russian. If you ever fight a Korean, it's like you're fighting a Russian from Asia, right? That's what they say. And if you fight a Filipino, it's like you're fighting a Mexican. I'm talking about style-wise, all right? So I guess that's one of the reasons why, because at the end of the day, all Filipinos want is like a brawl, like a hardcore stand-up banging fights. And Koreans obviously do that a lot. So that's one of the reasons too. And yes, K-pop also has an impact here. So what
But
was the
then why do you
question?
think like the UFC doesn't sign Filipino fighters? I don't think there's one Filipino fighter in the UFC right now.
There is. I think there's a Filipino American guy. I'm not sure if he's from Tough or where, but I actually met him a few weeks ago at the PI. But he's American. You know what I mean? He has an American passport. But just like what Mike said, it's just all about timing. At the end of the day, the biggest problem is visa. At the end of the day, also UFC is also a American-based global company that happens to have limitations on traveling to, let's say, London, Paris, Thailand, or to Korea because of COVID. So I guess over the past 18 months, that has been the biggest issue that we've been facing, is that the UFC is interested with the Koreans and they know that the Korea is the best in Asia, but why would they sign them when they can't really keep their contract, which is to provide them with 4 fights a year or 6 fights a year? And obviously with one championship too, they're based in Asia. Signing American fighters, yeah, that makes sense because Americans don't really have a problem entering the Asian country with visa. And they're Singapore based, so they can always have a flexibility on providing them with visas or the documents or the paperwork that the American fighters needs. And also Singapore, speaking of Singapore, is an Asian country with a lot of flexibility for a lot of Asian fighters. So it's easier for them to sign them. Unlike the UFC, they need to keep their words, which is provide them with 4 fights to 6 fights, depending on their contract. And the visa issue is just terrible. One thing I learned from management is I've learned a lot from travel to visa documents are the two biggest things I've learned while working as a MMA manager. So I guess that's the biggest factor. And speaking of China, I mean, why would you not sign Chinese fighters when they are the biggest investors out of almost all countries, right? How much money did they invest? They literally built a PI down there at the Shanghai, and their TV deal is nothing like what any other Asian fighters or any other Asian countries can offer. So, in my opinion, it kind of sucks that the Korean fighters don't really get to be signed, but at the same time, it kind of makes sense in their perspective because you can't only think about your perspective with the fighters and be like, oh, why aren't they signing this? Nah, 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 nah. You can't be doing that. You also have to be thinking about the promotion's perspective on why they can't do it or why they should. So I completely understand it, but I'm not saying like it's a healthy thing for me or the community around me. But yeah, if that answers your questions, it makes sense. And at the same time, at least if the UFC signs you, they will give you fights, right? They will guarantee you fights. Like at least once a year, you get to fight. Like Dana says, it's his job to put fights every Saturday. On the other hand, one championship would sign you, but the question is, can you really fight? Like, will they really guarantee you the fight that you've signed for? Yeah, the money might look good, but is it really good until you fight? I mean, that's just my own perspective of the differences of one championship signing and the UFC signing. It's just that I'd rather be signed to a company and take longer time and have my promises kept, unlike the other side where they might promise me fairyland or see dinosaurs and fucking unicorns and not be able to see them, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So did that answer your question?
I think at the end of the day, it's also just a numbers game. Forget looking at it from an international perspective, just even stateside. I mean, okay, say the UFC, they have hundreds of signed fighters already with whom they are contractually obligated to give fights. And then aside from that, you have tens of thousands of people on the regional scene that want to fight for this. Oh, I want to be a UFC fighter. I want to be a pro MMA fighter. And even at the gyms, it's hard to be invited to train like on their MMA teams. And it's really hard to put that into perspective sometimes, just because you have all these people that want to make it to the big show, but these promotions, usually you hear more about cuts than you do signings, just because there's so, I wouldn't say bloated rosters, but they just have so many mouths to feed and fights to give, and you also have to divide that amongst all the weight classes between male and female. So, and then with each event, there's what, like maybe 10 fights, and scattered among that, you have all those various weight classes and the male and female. So it's, again, very hard to get that many opportunities for a specific weight class in a given card. And so when you spread that out over the course of the year, even, that's still not that many opportunities, especially for the amount of demand that there is for, or at least the amount of desire there is for fighters that would want to fight for UFC, for Bellator, and so forth. Even on the regional scene, there's lots of people that are just dying to get on these shows. But again, there are only so many spots that can be filled at any given time. So that's just almost just a built-in roadblock or bottleneck to the process.
How important is it for like a fighter, especially like, let's say, an international fighter, to be stateside right now? Because there's so many fallouts, there's so many short notice offers, even with Bellator, even with the PFL, and of course the UFC. You know, do you suggest fighters to move stateside now, especially during this time, during the pandemic, where like travel is very limited, and it's not like they could fly you in a week's notice anymore.
Right.
You know, you have to be there, you have to be in the country.
Right. Generally speaking, I would, just from like COVID aside, just from a training perspective, I think a lot of the top gyms and most successful MMA gyms are stateside. So just strictly from a training perspective, I would recommend that. But also, yes, definitely, as Kevin was alluding to, like with like visa issues, like I think for an international fighter to move to stateside, getting a green card is like the holy grail of being viable in terms of signing with these organizations. But yeah, in fact, a couple of my guys right now, Michelin Becerra, he's moving from Brazil to the United States later this year. One of my new guys I just signed, Didi Alano, he's he's thinking about moving abroad to North America, perhaps to just expand on his training and so forth. Because for as international as the sport is, elite training facilities are quite hard to come by. There's not as many as you would think. So that could also be a reason why certain international markets aren't as prevalent in the major promotions as you'd expect. I think you're starting to see, for example, like Africa, like they have, like, I think a good majority of the current UFC champions are African based, and like that's very much, I like to call it an emerging market in terms of the MMA scene. And Korea too, like they have a couple of elite gyms there and several elite fighters that have or are currently fighting for the UFC. I mean, you have Duo Choi coming up. We just saw Zombie with fantastic performance the other week. So, and even for his last fight, that's where he had his camp. He came back stateside to have his camp. And in years past, he's trained with Alpha Male like many years ago. So I absolutely do think that training in the US is likely the best situation. But again, each situation is different. There are plenty of fantastic gyms in Brazil, in abroad, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend, say, a guy that's fighting out of Connecticut or New York to all of a sudden move to Brazil, especially if he's not Brazilian, that can't speak any Portuguese. It's just kind of putting a fish out of water for no reason. But especially since all the big fights are stateside, big promotions are stateside, that's, in terms of increasing your odds, that's probably your best bet. Just from a regional perspective, you have a lot of good regional shows, and obviously from the major shows, that's where you want to be as well.
But like with Korea in particular, and in Asia, there are rarely any high level or state of the art facilities. I mean, the best facility I've ever visited would be in Thailand. Like just looking at it, of course they have the PI in Shanghai, right? I haven't been there yet, but of course that would probably be the best facility in Asia because you know what the PI offers. But in Korea, there are no state of the art facilities. Like their gyms are tiny. They're probably as big as your apartment, Michael, where you live right now. You know what I mean? Like that's how big the gyms are. But they're creating these killers though. You know what I mean? So imagine you have those killers in these facilities. And like you said, if they go stateside and they have the highest level of training partners, they could be the elite killers. You know what I mean? You could build them into that. And that's all it takes is, you know, we make it sound easy, like that's all it takes. But, you know what I mean? It is difficult to get over there. But you got to invest in yourself. And fighters, one thing about them is they invest in themselves, but they don't want to do the other things. Right. And that's where you guys come in. You guys have to convince them like, hey, you need to do this, and then you're going to be able to, you know,
well, the right
signed.
fighters, you don't have to convince. The right fighters, they know that already, and the work that they need to do is inherent. They're training even if they don't have a fight coming. They're in camp when they don't have a camp to be in, and so when they do get the call, they can hit the ground running. So those are the perfect fighters. Those are the ones that are easy to work with. Sometimes, yes, you're right. There are others you need to kind of give them a kick in the ass to get them motivated and stuff, and just get them moving. But that's, as you said, that's where we come in and to help them along with that process.
Kevin, talk about your experience because you were in Korea. You're trying to sign Korean fighters, and then you want to take them stateside. And talk about just dealing with like Asian fighters and them and trying to push them to go to better facilities and get better training in their life, because I think a lot of them, that's what you want to do. Now, I'm not just talking about Korean fighters, Filipinos, Japanese, whatever. And you see a lot of these other countries sending fighters abroad and going to the US. But have you seen like struggles in just trying to convince them to do it? And it's almost like they don't want to go out of their comfort zone, right? And they're fighters. They're always out of their comfort zone.
I mean, John, you've been to, I guess, one of the most successful MMA gym with me in Korea, right? MMA Story. I mean, you said it yourself. How many champions have they provided in a basement gym with a rent of $500? And how many world champions have they created, right? Minwoo Kim, Mugyum Choi, Cha Jong-won, Red Horse, and then you see all these other up-and-coming fighters that are just killers from that basement itself. So every time I sign someone, or let's say I have a client in Korea, I would always visit their gym just to see what the training is like. Even if it's out of my own pocket, I would go visit them. And from what I see is their training is almost like a military system where you're actually just killing your own self. All right. Okay, you're doing MMA, but at the same time, it's not what it should be. And obviously, I'm saying this from a perspective where I've traveled a lot of the states. I mean, I've traveled throughout the world, right? So every time I try to convince them, their number one problem is financially. I mean, fighters are broke until you make it to the UFC, right? That's the whole thing. And the number two is, even if they are capable of going, the problem is they don't want to go out of their own comfort zone, which is, oh, hey, bro, I don't speak English. Hey, I don't know what to do there. And I'm just like, bro, then why am I with you telling you to go out of your comfort zone when I'm not going to go with you? And they're like, oh, it doesn't make sense to me right now. Oh, my coach doesn't want me to leave. Oh, my mom doesn't want me to leave. These are like the constant excuses that you just hear, and it's just kind of frustrating because just in Vegas, just over the last 3 months, how many fighters have I seen that just walked in as a short-term replacement? Foreign fighters that are actually investing in themselves. Like just the other week, LFA had the main event of Horiuchi versus Charles Johnson, right?
Mm-hmm.
You see a lot of Japanese fighters recently fighting in Invicta and LFA, fighting for the belt or fighting for the main card and making it to the UFC under the radar. And that's happening because I believe the Japanese fighters are more aware that if you actually invest in yourself at the level where you're in, I know the complications that goes behind this, but still, at least they're trying and they're doing it, and that they're making it to the UFC. 2019, I believe Japanese market was dry for the UFC. 2020, I should say middle, and 2021, how many Japanese fighters are in the UFC right now? Right? And it's not because someone's like sponsoring them. No, I've spoken to Naoki Inoue. What's the fighter's name? John from Ryzen. Inoue, former UFC. He used to be a flyweight. He's like my age. He has a sister that's in the UFC.
Yeah, Inoue. Yeah, Naoki
Yeah,
Inoue.
Inoue, like Mizuki. Yeah, like I talked to his sister, Mizuki Inoue. She's currently at Vegas. And I had a word with her, and she said, it seems like there's two options or three options for the Japanese fighter, which is one championship, Ryzen, just like her brother, or just like myself, Mizuki Inoue, which is invest in myself, move to the stateside, fight in the United States, and then see how it goes there, and increasing your odds. And comparing it to Korea or to other Asia, none of them are actually willing or wanting to do what it takes to be in the UFC. I feel like it seems like the fighters think like, oh, if I'm like 10-2, a world champion in this organization, I should be signed to the UFC. Is what a lot of Korean fighters actually think and function. And then that's where I come in, pull out the chart, and I just show them our Russian roster. That's the easiest way to go. I'm like, if you see your division, this is your bantamweight, let's say, right? Yes, your bantamweight. I'll pull out the Russian roster and show them how many Russian fighters there are, and then compare it to him. Out of 1,000, I should say 400 of them are 10-1, which is a similar record to yours. So now you tell me where you stand out of just the Russian market. So now you got to go out of the box, invest in yourself, move to the States, and now if you need a translation, if you're not comfortable because there's no one for you, then I'll go with you, just like what I'm doing with Hyon. But still, I feel like this is not enough for me to convince them. I feel like there needs to be a company that needs to sponsor them in order for them to get going. And also, the biggest problem is half of the roster of what I've signed have a gym, right? I mean, half of them have their own personal gym that is being run by them. So I guess, yeah, that's the biggest issue.
That's some big obstacles right there, especially if you have your own business going on, in your country. But I guess you can't. Michael, do you run into that, like where there's fighters where they have other things going on in their life? It's like they're trying to balance too much at one time. And if you do want to be a fighter and go to the highest level, you have to be 110% into the fighting, right? Do you see guys out there balancing it out and still making it to the elite levels? It's not in the States,
People that are not in the States, or
not in the States. It's more difficult, right? If you're in the States, you could have
of course. It's inherently going to be much more difficult to try to do this when you're from abroad, because just moving. I mean, I moved apartments like in January, and that was a big pain. And within my building, to move internationally to a country where it might be a language where I don't speak, and especially if I don't necessarily have a way to viably bring in money to feed myself or my family outside of that, it's daunting. It's very hard, and to that extent, I can sort of empathize with why it might be difficult just to want to make that leap, but it's kind of like a necessary. But that's what it is. It's a leap of faith to do that, because really you do need to do that to test yourself. And as Kevin mentioned before, like there's 10-2, and then there's 10-2. I mean, like let's see who you want to get to that 10-2. Like, did you get that 10-2 by fighting a bunch of cans that are like 3-3, 0-4, and so forth, or did you get it by fighting a bunch of top-notch fighters from like Kazakhstan or something? There's a big difference. So the record doesn't lie, but there's always a story behind the record. And in terms of finding that balance, it's tough. You got to make that decision to be able to commit fully to do so. I mean, it's hard enough to do so for someone living stateside. I mean, like Marcus, again, you know this. I mean, he works full time in finance and fights professionally at a high level essentially on the side, but he manages his time to be able to do this and pursue what he loves. And if he can do it, certainly anyone else could if they really wanted to. And I know that sounds a bit cheesy, but like really, like if you want it that badly, you need to make sacrifices to be able to at least take a shot. And you say it's your dream, then make sure you have no regrets when you go for it.
Yeah, and also it's what is your dream and what is your priority, right? Like if your dream is to make as much money as you can and you're in Asia, maybe you do sign with one championship. You know what I mean? Maybe you feel like, okay, if I go to the UFC, it's a longer road to that path to get to, to get to that goal. So it's like, okay, maybe I sign with one championship, I make a little bit more money. Because a lot of times, like guys that are getting paid on the regional scene and they get signed by the bigger promotions, they're not getting paid the same amount. They're actually getting paid less. You know what I mean? Are you willing to sacrifice that? Like, are you willing to, you got to know your position as a fighter, I guess. And then the managers, they have to listen to that and then, and then decide the path and that they take, right. And to try to help them and that's why I say like, not every fighter is fit for the UFC. Not every fighter is fit for one championship. You've seen it right now. Demetrius Johnson is fighting for one championship. There's a reason why he's over there. There's a reason why Eddie Alvarez is over at one championship, right? There's a reason why Anthony Pettis is fighting for the PFL. There's a reason why Patricio Pitbull is fighting for Bellator, right? It's all the same, right? It's not all the same. It's all different. You know what I mean? Their path. And maybe they might end up in the UFC. Who knows? But it's not the same for everybody, right? But one thing is the same for everybody. If you want to fight for a major promotion, global promotion, you have to be in the States now. You have to be. Like, your path is quicker if you're there fighting on the regional scene compared to fighting on the regional scene in Korea, right? If you're fighting for Road FC, and I know about Road FC, right? I know their contracts and stuff like that. And I think, Mike, you know a little bit about what they're doing too. And Kevin knows a lot about what they're doing. The company is. It's going to be very difficult to be fighting for Road FC and then try to get signed by the UFC. It's just right. It's just a reality. We're not going to get into details about it because that's the fighters and what they do. How they deal with the promotion, but that's what it is. And it reminds me of like when the UFC announced that they're going to do Contender Series Asia, right? And I was just like, okay, now the path has gotten shorter for the fighters, right? Now they're going to be focusing on the Asian market and then allowing these fighters to come in and compete and then get signed by the UFC. But that has never materialized, right? And now it seems like Contender Series Asia is not even going to happen, right? And then I'm hearing things about that this Contender Series is going to be part of the Contender Series Asia is just going to be part of the regular Contender Series, right? Do you guys know anything about what is happening with the Contender Series Asia? Have you heard anything through the pipeline? You know what I mean? Like, can you reveal anything? Any of you?
I haven't personally heard anything about that myself, but I mean, you mentioned like, oh, it's not happening. I mean, a lot of things have been happening. I mean, the freaking Olympics didn't happen last year because based on the current situation. So it's no surprise that something like that wouldn't happen as well. So I think another, not to go too far off topic, is that just when you look at the sport of MMA, it's still very much a young sport. I mean, when were those first original UFC events when Meyerowitz and what was it, like in like mid 90s, I was in like fifth graders and so forth. And when you compare that to other sports, which have been around for like 100 years, like baseball, football, soccer, they've been around forever. So those sports have grown at an international level to become these incredible billion-dollar industries, and I mean much more so than what MMA is. I mean, yes, you have the UFC that's huge now, but again, overall, there's still a long way to go, both for the growth of the sport itself and ultimately for the fighters. I mean, they only recently started getting mainstream coverage on ESPN, for example. And once the UFC made that TV deal with them, that's when you start noticing more and more headlines on like the ESPN main page with MMA stories appearing, and that's only within like the last year. And it took this long just to get to that point, just to get a little headline on, you know, a main sports webpage. So there's still a long way to go, and I think we have to keep that in perspective when we try to compare that with just things like with Dana White, with the Contender Series coming to Asia and things like that. Everything's growing, and I think even compared to what it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it's come a long way, and hopefully it'll continue to grow as it's been. But I think it's hard to say this to a fighter who has limited shelf life, but these are the times we have to be as patient as we can, and we have to work with what the current environment is. And as you mentioned, to be stateside is the best opportunity for that. I mean, if I wanted to work in a startup, I'd go to Silicon Valley. If I want to be a professional poker player, I'd go to Vegas. And there's always the place that you need to be depending on what you want to do. I mean, you want to be artistic, but I mean, when you're doing, you know, at some point, if you want to be a renowned painter, you wanted to be in France and so forth. So there's always the right location depending on what you want to do. And for MMA in particular, definitely I would have to say stateside.
Kevin, what about you? What have you heard about the Contender Series Asia? Can you give us anything?
Till further notice.
Until further notice. Wow. So there's just like they just put it on the shelf. So it's just like we're gonna put it in the refrigerator and let it cool off a little bit, and then we'll bring it back.
But you know, this is like the second time that it happened. So I don't know. Let's see how it goes. Nobody's gonna know until the end of the year, anyways. But I should say I am bummed out. I mean, from what I've heard or understood off of the street, is that the UFC was going to come to Singapore as well. That got canceled too. So canceling Contender Series Asia, let's say it is canceled, and I wouldn't be surprised, but I would be very, very bummed out, because I believe you would agree with me here, because that's a show, or that could have been an event where the Koreans would come out and show their full capability. You know what I mean? Because in my opinion, it seems like the UFC has never really signed the real talents out of Korea, which is my opinion. So it could have been a blooming chance where the real talents or the real killers from Korea could have actually showcased what real Korea is about. So yeah, to answer your question, it's just until further notice.
Yeah, and I also thought when they were announcing the Contender Series, I thought like, okay, this is a chance for just not Koreans or Chinese. I thought it was a chance for like even the Thai fighters and the Filipinos and the Cambodians, if they can find, you know, fighters from those countries to come in and match up against each other with good records that have potential, and if they perform well enough, you know, at the Performance Institute or wherever they're going to hold these events, and get signed by the UFC. That's what I wanted, you know, because at the end of the day, when you look at the percentage of fighters signed from Asia, it is probably the lowest in the world, right? It's just the truth, right? Who would you consider the best fighter from Asia? It's either Zhang Wei Li or the Korean Zombie, right? And probably the most popular fighter worldwide is the Korean Zombie in Asia, right? Would you guys agree that would be the most popular fighter, right?
Yeah.
So, but the Korean Zombie is not going to be around forever. You know what I mean? Like he's very close to, you know, if he doesn't make it to the title in this run, it's like we might not see him fight again past maybe 2022. You don't, you know, because his body's a wreck. You got to look at what he's been through in his career, man. And he just hurt his shoulder again. And that's just something that he had surgery on. and he had. You remember the Aldo fight? It came
Yep,
out of
I
place.
remember
That's everybody remembers that, right? Because it seemed like he was turning it up at that moment, and then his shoulder popped out, and then it was Aldo saw that and went for the kill, and props to Aldo for seeing that. But yeah, it's just like we like for you, Michael, like you're stateside. Do you get like messages from people in Asia like they're looking for opportunity, or do you never see that? And maybe that's a problem. You never see people reaching out.
Yeah, no, I do get messages from people like from everywhere, whether it's stateside, Middle East, Asia. But there's always a vetting process that you need to go through, especially when they come to you in that way, because it's very different than when someone's being referred to you by someone at a gym that you train with. So it's essentially being cold called. But yeah, I do get that from time to time, but it's a complete unknown. Like I don't know who this guy is. Like I don't know what your background is. It could be some guy that's like, oh, I train UFC, bro, and just just wants to. I mean, I get that in person, even at places I train at. So and I'm sure Kevin has experienced the same thing. So it's just, I wouldn't say about reaching out directly, but again, like to speak to your point, like about like, there's only one zombie. Yeah, there is only one zombie. He's a special commodity for the sport of MMA and especially Korea. And I've always been a fan of him, especially because of that. But yeah, hopefully when you have guys like that, it increases the visibility of the sport within the country itself. Like even my parents know who it is, and like they MMA is not their sport, and but that's why you have like up and comers now too, like Duo Choi, a couple other guys. I just let my mom. He just fought a couple of weeks ago, had a nice finish, and so it's there. And I think it's for us as forget being like managers or media, just as consumers and fans of the sport, just got to be patient, especially right now. Like I think the Contender will come back. I mean, to Asia at some point. Just again, it's kind of a mulligan with everything that the pandemic has caused. Again, it's canceled the Olympics. It's canceled the basketball season. It's even with the Olympics now, it's going to be spectatorless, and it's even everything stateside is just slowly coming out of its shell. So just again, it's one hell of a act of God that we have to deal with this pandemic. But I think in due time. I mean, the PI in Shanghai was a big step, and I think we just need to be realistic with our expectations in terms of how fast this growth will actually occur at.
And another thing was that what was I going to get into is yeah, the thing that I wanted to get into before we like end this thing is I don't know if you guys saw this, but Sarah Alpar, did you see the UFC fighter? She started a GoFundMe, and then like Jake Paul like he donated like $5,000, and then Triller donated like $25,000 to yeah, a lot of money, right? And it just helped her out, right? And she said she needed money for camp, and
money for camp
what
is bigger than her purse.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. Like that, that's the thing. That's another thing, right? Is for you guys when you guys are negotiating, right? It's just, are you guys pitted in a corner in some ways when you got the fighter and then you got the promotion and the organization kind of going back and forth, you know what I mean? Because you're the middleman basically, and you got to satisfy both sides. So how is that? How stressful is that? Let's start with you, Kevin. How stressful is it to be the middleman and you have to satisfy both sides?
Wait, are you talking about fighters that are currently signed with a promotion?
It doesn't matter because you have to sign a new contract no matter what, right? Every fight is a new contract.
Oh yeah. So,
and it's not just about money; it's about matchups. It's about placement on the card. There's all kinds of stipulations that's going on right during a fight when you sign a fight or when you get signed.
I guess there's a clear difference when a fighter is complaining with sense and he's complaining with nonsense. If I feel like it's nonsense and we keep going back and forth, and it seems like he or she is not making the right move because that person or that fighter is not clearly thinking well, then I would speak directly to the coach. And if the coach just gives a green light, then I wouldn't even make it a deal. I'll just make it done, you know. And the other thing is, yeah, it's so hard because sometimes, well, here's the thing. First of all, I don't work with American fighters. I work with Korean fighters who at most times don't really have a clear indication of what's going on. So every time they're not satisfied, then obviously I have to go from A till Z and then explain why and how this happened and why he or she should take it and why he or she is only getting paid this amount of money. And if I feel like they still cannot take it or won't take it, then like I said, go back to the coach. If the coach says yes, then I'll make it done. And I don't know, so far I've never had a problem where the promotion was not happy with the fighters we had. And the fighters were, I should say, 75% of them were really happy with the money that they were making. So I can't really say out of my own experiences, but if this was to happen for me, then yeah, I would just get it done without having to be hustled by the fighter. I don't know. I can't honestly answer this because never really had that.
Michael, like being in the middle, right? Like being pulled in two directions, right? You're like that cartoon where the one, you're one guy's pulling you, the other guy, you're like stretched out, right? How stressful is that? You know what I mean? Of course you work for the fighter, but then you have to have a balance, right? You cannot just be like, oh, this is what the fighter wants. And then you get to the situation where you're in a stalemate. Like the fighter doesn't get anything, their promotion doesn't get anything. Nobody wins at the end of the day, right? So that balance, dude, how stressful is that?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, at times, sure, it can become stressful, but to be honest, that's what I love about it. I mean, that's why I do it, because I love being that middleman. I love being able to have a meeting of the minds and putting fights together for my fighter and, of course, for the promotion. But yeah, at the end of the day, I represent the fighter. And what matters to me most is the best interest of the fighter that I'm representing, from a health perspective, from a personal perspective, and certainly from a financial perspective. And frankly, I would rather say no to a fight if that's the right answer than say yes and force him to or encourage him to take a fight that would put him in a less than ideal situation just for the sake of getting a commission. Then I shouldn't be. That's not. That's not how I go about doing things. Because what matters to me more than the purse itself is the well-being of my fighter. I mean, we don't do this for the money, the fighters or me for that matter. I mean, shoot, we know, again, as you say, the way they have to put a GoFundMe. I mean, some fighters, they have freaking OnlyFans accounts, which is, hey, listen, if you can make money however you can, safely, legally, go for it. But like, when you think, it's a little, like, if you thought about, like, say, like an athlete like in the NBA or tennis or soccer, like having to do that, it's almost embarrassing in a way that that it has to come to that. Like they should be paid fair consideration for what they do, and I think that's one area that's probably lagged a little bit. Understatement is fighter compensation, but when it comes to being the middleman, yeah, of course, it's you want to give the promotion what they want, but again, you want, more importantly, to do what's best for your fighters, because you have they're similar interests, but they're not the same. They're parallel, because what the promotion wants is not the same as what me as a manager necessarily wants, because promotion, they just want to put good fights, and usually they have their A-corner guy that they're trying to build up, and they don't necessarily care about what my guy wants, right? They just want to have a good matchup. And my goal is just to put them in a situation where both of those interests intersect and align, where the promotion wants this fight and it's a good opportunity for my fighter to showcase his skills, or it's an opportunity for him to get to the next level. And so where I come in then is liaising with the promotions, touching base with the coach, with the fighter, doing our due diligence, researching the fighter, researching their background, and then determining, hey, is this a good situation that we want at this time? In fact, just recently, with one of my guys, we got a good opportunity, but ultimately decided to pass on it because it was a bit short notice. The opponent was very tough, and it wasn't necessarily the right opportunity at this time to take. And as long as, for me, I always try to be transparent, upfront, and honest as possible. Not as possible, as just straightforward, honest with both the fighters and the promotions. It's okay. I mean, they understand, and they still want to have this guy on for their future shows. And so that's how I operate. It's as long as I can operate and communicate with them openly, honestly, and with integrity, the rest ultimately takes care of itself, or will take care of itself. But again, like, of course, I want to please promotions for the sake of all my fighters. But at the end of the day, I'm looking out for my fighters first, and I'll always look out for my fighters first.
At the end of the day, it goes back to what Mike was saying earlier about how young this sport is. And, of course, we want this fighter pay to, go up as much as possible, as fast as possible. But then we got to understand, yes, this is a young sport. There's all these problems that we have. It's not just about fighter pay. It's about even the rules and the judging. There's so much stuff going on right now that needs to be, figured out over the next 10, 20, 30 years as the sport moves along. So, we could sit here and talk about it for 10 hours, right? About how there's so many things wrong, but I'm glad you guys are helping the fighters out. I know how you guys both operate. You guys both have different, I guess, tactics or like strategic moves that you make throughout, your when you actually do your job. But at the end of the day, you guys are helping fighters get fights, getting fighters paid, and trying to guide their careers into the path that the fighters want, right? And it's going to be successful for them. And that's why we talk. You know what I mean? That's why I got you guys on the show. And then hopefully I could get you guys back on the show in a couple more months together and talk about other, topics. Today I wanted to go over a lot of stuff, but really I didn't even get into like half the things that I wanted to talk about because we kind of got lost in the beginning, right? But I feel like that's a topic at the start that we kind of discussed, a little bit, that should be something that should be brought up. And I'm not the best at expressing myself. That's why I interview people, because I'm not the best at expressing myself, right? So hopefully, we do this again. And I like the combination is because all three of us have different personalities, you know what I mean? And different viewpoints, even though we have a lot of similarities. So getting you guys on, expressing yourselves is something that I want to continue doing on this platform. And I'm happy to have you guys on, and thank you so much for spending the evening for Mike and the morning for Kevin, and hopefully you guys will come back on in the future and we'll do it again. Thank you everybody for joining us, and follow these guys on social media. If you follow me on social media, then you should know their tags. Go follow them, and we'll see them in the future. Thank you so much, guys.
No,
Wait, John,